Howdy y'all. First and foremost, today we're going to be looking at some of the oldest and most unique photographs of the Great Salt Lake City, Utah and the surrounding area. A big shout out goes to Jon Levi. He really inspired me recently and I wanted to try to take my own dive into the convoluted history of this area. And what I found will certainly go hand in hand with his work and with the work of so many others. The main focus today not only being the elaborate temple of the Latter-day Saints, but the almost overnight eruption of architecture into Salt Lake City, which for years was seemingly impossible to reach. As we look through this architecture, these photographs, the postcards, artistic depictions, we will try to delve into the often convoluted history of this area. In doing so, my concern is to familiarize you with the key characters and components of the current narrative, while reminding you to always question what has been put forth to us in this historical context. Salt Lake City is often a topic of videos, with many seemingly eviscerating the current narrative or skipping over it entirely. Today, we will rapidly try to go down the path of the current narrative and see what sort of anomalies stand out to us. And excuse my pun, but as always, take the current narrative with a grain of salt. The Great Salt Lake is the largest saltwater lake in the Western Hemisphere, being the 8th largest terminal lake or lake without a drainage basin in the world. In the time of the last ice age, between 30,000 and 13,000 years ago, most of North America was a frozen tundra. During this time, water levels rose dramatically along the northwestern coast, eventually creating the largest paleo lake in Western North America. It covered at least what is today the Great Basin of America. This was known as Lake Bonneville. As temperatures continued to decrease, the water could not evaporate, and with nowhere to flow, it began to rise. Eventually, this rise hit an apex at roughly Red Rock Pass in southeastern Idaho. Here, Lake Bonneville met the Snake River, finally allowing an outlet to centuries of backed up water. This caused the Lake Bonneville flood, said to be one of the most tremendous flooding events in American history. Estimates vary, but the emptying of Lake Bonneville lasted 1 year or more. During this emptying period, over 1,200 cubic miles of water drained with a maximum speed of 35 million cubic feet per second. To say that this changed the surrounding landscape is an understatement. By roughly 15,000 years ago, Lake Bonneville had nearly ceased to exist, with the warmer and drier climate once again returning the lake to a closed basin, and thus the Great Salt Lake was born. The Great Salt Lake is quite literally the remnants of Lake Bonneville after the Bonneville flood, with the two names simply identifying different periods in time. Roughly after the last Ice Age period, we then have the eventual occupation of the Great Salt Lake region by a multitude of different indigenous groups, including the Shoshone and the Ute. In their language, the Great Salt Lake's original name translated to the Bad Waters. The history of the Great Salt Lake then appears to hit a crossroads. The first written mention of the area does not come until the year 1776, when Sylvester Valdez de Escalante first hears mention of the magical Great Salt Lake landscape from the Ute people. De Escalante seems to hide his discovery, and the lake is not named, and it is not described again until 1824, when we're told mountain man Jim Bridger and Etienne Proverse both apparently reached the Great Salt Lake separately, unbeknownst to one another. What an odd coincidence. The confounding part about all this is, however, that the Great Salt Lake appears on maps as early as the 1570s, with most maps appearing to show what is today northwestern Canada as a still frozen tundra, with the Great Salt Lake visible just barely beneath the frozen landscape to the north. The most exciting example may be Nicholas Sanson's 1650 map of America, which accurately depicts the correct latitude and longitude of the Great Salt Lake while also showcasing California as an island. So as far as the current narrative goes, we have a 174-year period between when the Great Salt Lake is accurately, nearly to the exact degree depicted on a map in 1650, until the first accepted exploration of that area occurs in 1824. 4 years earlier, in 1820, on the other side of the country in western New York, a 15-year-old Joseph Smith, emblazoned by the Second Great Awakening, has a vision from the Lord. In his documents, he says that 3 years later, he was met by an angel who bestows upon him the location of the golden tablets. Now, according to Joseph, these golden tablets contain the true history of the world, left here by a previous civilization, one that flourished across America. Essentially, America in these tablets was once home to an advanced civilization who built massive kingdoms, roadways, canals, utilizing advanced technology with a special ability to harness and harvest gold. It is written that these individuals arrived to America after the fall of the Tower of Babel, and they were known as the Jaredites. With this belief transcribed in the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith began to spread his ideas across the country. However, there's another very important character when it comes to this narrative. This is when we enter one Solomon Spaulding, a seldom discussed individual who was born in 1761 in Ashford, Connecticut. He served in the Continental Army before then graduating from Dartmouth College in 1785. We know that Solomon existed. He has all of these records. He married in 1795, and after this, he moved to a large piece of land in Ohio. During his time on this land, he began to research burial mounds, and he began writing his 2 lifelong works, both considered to be lost or unpublished. The first was said to be titled the Oberlin Manuscript, which was purported by Solomon to have been translated from Latin, found on 24 parchment rolls in a mound near his new home in Ohio. Obviously, he was embellishing, but the story was said to consist of a Roman legion arriving to the New World only to encounter that it was already occupied with massive cities made by the mound builders. This coincided with popular newspaper articles of the time discussing the discoveries inside the ancient burial mounds found all across America. And as Solomon was writing this work, the War of 1812 eventually broke out, causing Solomon to flee to Pennsylvania when he then began his second, now unpublished and lost work. This was to be entitled Manuscript Found, again accompanied by the familiar story of a pre-Columbian civilization in America. In Manuscript Found, apparently, Romans heading for Britannia are blown severely off course, and in this narrative, they arrive to America, only to find that the great civilizations of America had not yet fallen to the Little Ice Age, and thus they could retell their histories, as they do in the novel. Now, in Solomon's fiction, it continues by claiming that the indigenous Americans are actually groups of Semitic people that were bound to America after the time of a great cataclysm. This fiction then continues by claiming that the mounds were actually those built by the Romans as burial mounds after the centuries of bloody battles which eliminated the original indigenous people. The Romans then attempted to return to Rome, only to find that Rome had amalgamated into the Holy Roman Empire. Thus, the legions that once conquered America then returned to America as the different countries of Europe. That is Solomon's narrative. However, after he passes away in 1816 after moving to Western Pennsylvania in hopes of getting his life's work published, we have another character who enters the fray. This is Sidney Rigdon. Rigdon was a founding member and leader of the Latter-day Saints movement beginning in the 1830s. However, first, in 1819, he had many failed ventures in preaching the gospel across America. Rigdon moved between Ohio and Pennsylvania, doing so many times throughout the early 1820s. Let's try to bring it all full circle. Solomon Spaulding, as I said, passed away in 1816 after reportedly moving to Western Pennsylvania in one last hope of getting his life's work published. He submitted his work to one publisher. This publisher was named Patterson, but the work that he submitted was never published. 3 years later, we then have Sidney Rigdon, a somewhat failed preacher who also keeps moving between the lands of Ohio and western Pennsylvania, similar to Solomon. Sidney Rigdon also has another part-time job, not often discussed but mentioned in his biography. He works as a publisher. For what company? Patterson. Many early leaders of the Latter-day Saints movement then end up coming directly from the congregation of Sidney Rigdon, who, according to this narrative, read the Book of Mormon one time and declared it to be the utmost truth. Within a year of Joseph Smith releasing the Book of Mormon, friends and family of Solomon Spaulding began to come forward claiming that the work was plagiarized. Entire magazines and newspapers, even entire books, were written looking to provide evidence that Solomon Spaulding's work had been manipulated, including 1834's Mormonism Unveiled, which interviewed key witnesses, publishers, friends, and family of Solomon Spaulding. We even have published news articles as far back as 1827, 3 years before the Book of Mormon was even published, claiming that Mormonism was the creation of Joseph Smith and a publishing benefactor, which, according to this theory, would have been Sidney Rigdon, with Solomon's plagiarized and slightly tweaked work as the core for the novel. Granted, while all this was happening, Joseph Smith is not even 25 years of age. Officially, we're told that Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon around 1830 before immediately feeling hostilities from within his own church. He then declared that Kirtland, Ohio, would be the new site of the church, the site of the church's New Jerusalem. Within 5 years, over 2,000 Mormons had moved to the vicinity of Kirtland, and Joseph would often venture out from Kirtland, looking for new locations to congregate and build his chapels. However, on one trip back to Ohio from Missouri, Joseph, Rigdon, and their constituents were tarred and feathered by local Ohio residents who opposed Joseph's control over the area. Eventually, this hostility caused the Saints to have to move again, this time to Missouri. But the entire time, Joseph continued to tour the country, typically gathering funds, preaching, and searching for historical artifacts. In 1838, Mormons were harassed while attempting to vote, causing a scuffle that led to the 1838 Mormon War. The Mormons eventually forfeited their lands, and Joseph Smith was sentenced to death. However, the local general refused to carry out this order. Smith was jailed indefinitely, and at this time, he put Brigham Young in charge of the Latter-day Saints. The Latter-day Saints, now expelled from Missouri, were quickly accepted into the town of Commerce in the swamps of Illinois. Joseph Smith quickly established his influence. Again, keep reading between the lines here, but once in Illinois, Joseph Smith gains massive wealth from European donations, as well as gaining workers that were shipped directly to Commerce. Joseph Smith uses his connections to attract John C. Bennett, the Quartermaster General of Illinois, and he further uses that connection to change the entire name of Commerce to Nauvoo, which is Hebrew for to be beautiful. Smith then establishes Nauvoo as basically an autonomous city with habeas corpus power. Nauvoo had its own militia, the Nauvoo Legion, loyal only to Joseph Smith, at the time being the largest military body in all of Illinois. In the more esoteric circle of this history, we're told in 1841 the Nauvoo Temple was founded, being the largest temple in that state, and it was dedicated solely to recovering and documenting lost ancient knowledge. This building was subsequently burned to the ground just 7 years later, with only one photograph of the building existing today. By 1843, Joseph Smith was a nationally known name, gaining hundreds of new followers every day. At this time, he also began to question the presidential candidates for 1844, asking them directly what they would do to protect Mormons. When none of them responded to his liking, Joseph then declared that he would run for president himself. However, his confidence seemed to get ahead of him, and upon his lavish claims of what he would do as president, a schism was created amongst his closest followers. A few descended directly, starting their own branch of his religion and creating their own newspaper to tarnish Joseph's name. Holding nearly king-like status over the Nauvoo area, Smith ordered his Nauvoo Legion to destroy and burn the newspaper of his competitors. This led to martial law being declared by Smith himself, who then used the chaos to flee out of Nauvoo. At Carthage, Illinois Governor Thomas Ford ordered Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram to stand trial for inciting a riot, charges that were raised to treason once the pair were in custody. While at Carthage jail, while awaiting trial, a large group of men, some would say over 200, stormed the jail in blackface paint. Hiram lost his life almost immediately. However, Joseph attempted to escape through a second or third story window, where he fell to the ground, only to find hundreds more waiting for him outside. At this point, the thousands of Mormons at Nauvoo had to again think their future and set forth to a new land, this time under their new leader, Brigham Young. The Donner Party, we're told, led the way for the colonization of Salt Lake City by the Mormons. In the 1840s, Manifest Destiny called to Americans who set out on the Oregon Trail to head west. This route of the Oregon Trail used something called the South Pass, relatively easy land to traverse by wagon. However, hoping to bank on this westward expansion, Lansford Hastings concocted a plan, a new trail, to take travelers through the Snake River Plain. Remember that from earlier as the location where Lake Bonneville spilled over? This new trail would take travelers across the Great Basin. However, Lansford designed this route based off of maps alone, and he had never actually traveled the route himself. He then sold the idea to startup families looking to head west for a new life, with over 500 wagons leaving Independence. The new trail was not free of hazards by any means, and was vastly more dangerous and underdeveloped, eventually leading to a group known as the Donner Party becoming lost amongst the landscape. As the story goes, the surviving members vigorously cut through the wilderness, struggling to survive while forging a new path. The path which would eventually become the official path used to reach Salt Lake City by the Mormons. By August 20th of 1846, the Donner Group had reached the Great Salt Lake, leaving their cut path behind them. However, their story only gets more difficult from here, so our key focus moving forward will be the path that led to Salt Lake City that was mysteriously cut and seemingly left behind for the Latter-day Saints. Just a year later, we're told the Latter-day Saints arrived, and from 1847 through 1850, the only people to live in and around the Great Salt Lake were the Mormons, numbering at roughly 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children, as well as the indigenous people of that area. The Great Salt Lake City was chosen when Brigham Young uttered the famous phrase, "It is enough. This is the right place." Many European settlers avoided the area at all costs after hearing about the Donner Party tragedy. The first official U.S. report of the Great Salt Lake did not occur until 1850, which is the same year that Congress organized the Utah Territory out of the state of Deseret. The state of Deseret being the name given by the Mormons to their vast array of land that they controlled between the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada. The symbol of the early Mormons and the proposed state of Deseret would have been a beehive made to resemble a mound, as being founded throughout America at that time in history. This was a big draw of the Latter-day Saints. They tried to apply ancient archaeology and ancient remains in a way that would explain their everyday life in America. Brigham Young was Utah Territory's first governor. The city of the Great Salt Lake was officially formed on January the 6th, 1851. In 1856, the capital of the Utah Territory was moved from Fillmore to the city of the Great Salt Lake, which shortened the name officially to Salt Lake City. When James Buchanan, president, began to oppose Mormonism in 1857, he sent 2,500 troops to Salt Lake City, which is when Brigham Young declared martial law, something that appears to occur repeatedly in Salt Lake City history. Buchanan sent a new governor for the new Utah Territory, Alfred Cumming, and at this time, Brigham stood down. After the outbreak of the Civil War, multitudes of troops were sent to Salt Lake City to defend the route to California. In 1863, these soldiers began to discover veins of gold and silver in and around Salt Lake City, leading to a small population boom. Brigham Young was not an abolitionist, and he worked to keep his community separated. In 1868, he opened what many consider to be the first department store, Zion's Mercantile. However, by 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad reached Utah, bringing with it the change that brought Salt Lake City into the modern time. Then, we have the architecture that we're going to look at. By the year 1900, Salt Lake City is still relatively secluded as far as outsiders, besides those working in the factories and the mines. The majority of the culture was run both in the limelight and behind closed doors by the Latter-day Saints. We see massive architecture appearing all over the city, which continues well into the early 1900s. However, the Great Depression was said to almost obliterate Salt Lake City, leaving over a third of all the adults unemployed, and the average income per person was cut in half from 1929 through 1932. People could not afford to live in the city. The working class mostly fled or moved to the slums, and those who did remain in Salt Lake City were the businessmen, the merchants, and the leaders of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. By the end of World War II, Salt Lake City was, for lack of a better term, back on its feet, and the population began to grow again, and the economy began to grow again, and all of a sudden, we get these new photographs showcasing all of this immense architecture all around Salt Lake City. But today's focus in today's video, the images were before the Great Depression. So a majority of these photographs will be from the 1800s, from the early 1900s. These were meant to be the oldest photographs of Salt Lake City, so you could see what the Mormons came upon when they found this land. That's about as far as I wanted to dive into the history for now. I have no idea really how long this summary will be, because the history of Salt Lake City just keeps pushing forth more information, and all of it feels very relevant and still questionable to me. As we see the tabernacle, the massive church, the architecture, the outline of a seemingly well built out city, it's hard to imagine that a group of unskilled workers arrived here through tracks that were literally cut the year previously. It's hard to imagine these just 150 men, women, and children could transform a seemingly inhospitable landscape into one that was homely and well known by the time of the first official survey just 3 years later. Essentially, to break it down into the simplest terms, we're told that we have two groups of European settlers who were heading out. One being the Donner Party, which originally had over 500 people. It was the larger group that actually had skilled workers with them. This group ended up getting lost. They nearly all lost their lives. They could not build anything. They could not find any food, and they could not survive without assistance from the government. Then, at the same time, less than 1 year later, we have a much smaller party of Latter-day Saints with far less people who make the same trip in less time, and the second group, these Latter-day Saints, nearly entirely survive. They thrive. They set up a new community, a new city, and this city quickly becomes the massive Great Salt Lake City. It's like two competing narratives for the same spot in history, almost like two versions of the same story have been presented to us. One that is believable yet full of hardships, and one that is almost miraculous in nature. The ones that we know today, the one that tells us of founded gold plates and founded lost work, and describes what could be a controversy when we look at Solomon and we look at Rigdon. Overall, what we have here and what I'm saying is the history of Salt Lake City is beyond questionable. There's nothing in this narrative that leaves me with a strong feeling of solidarity or truth, or that what we're being told is 100% the full story. There's so much more here behind closed doors that I'd like to get into, but I first wanted to present my 2 cents with you to see what you have to say, to see if you have any more relevant information or links or even photographs that can help point us in the right direction of understanding this narrative. The Salt Lake appears, much like the waters themselves, to leave us floating when all we want to do is a deep dive. But that's just the current mainstream narrative. And as always, take everything you've heard today with a grain of salt.